So Mahamani has taken us up to the Buddha's enlightenment in the first teaching. Maitreya tomorrow will approach the very mysterious subject of the Buddha's final passing away. And I've got the 45 years in between. The records of which stretch to several thousand pages. So I thought I'd start on page 1. Just kidding. So I won't give an account of his teaching life. I won't even really give any history. I'm more going to ask or understand the question as, what was the Buddha trying to do with his teaching? Which is another way of saying, what did he give us? And I'm going to start with a quote, which is from the American novelist Marilynne Robinson. The book is called Gilead, and it takes the form of a long letter from a priest who has a terminal illness and is writing this long letter to his 7-year-old son, so who's too young to read it, but will in years to come after the father's death, explaining a lot of things to him about his life and their family's history. It goes all the way back to sort of the Civil War generation, set in the 1950s. They're from a family of priests. His father was a priest, his grandfather another one. And he's musing about life. So he says to his son in this letter, "One great benefit of a religious vocation is that it helps you concentrate. It gives you a good, basic sense of what is being asked of you, and also what you may as well ignore. If I have any wisdom to offer, this is a fair part of it." Okay. So, people often ask if Buddhism is a religion. Sangharakshita has given a much better answer than I could ever come up with, which is, it's either not a religion or it's the only religion. So don't worry about religious in that quote. And that it helps you concentrate, gives you a good basic sense of what's being asked of you, and also what you may as well ignore. Again, I'll come back to. So the Buddha basically wandered and met with people. I was trying to sum up his teaching life to myself as simply as I could, and that was his basic activity. He met with people. In between, he meditated. It sounds like slept really only as much as he strictly needed to, ate what he strictly needed to, and met with people, and spoke to them, and answered their questions. So did that for many, many, many years. And he spoke to them on their terms, in their language, and gave them teachings appropriate to their situation. So just one quick example, he was often overturning Brahminical law and practices. That was the ancient Indian traditions, which eventually I think concretized into what's called Hinduism now. But ancient Indian religion, in which a common practice was to keep 3 fires burning in your house, and they all had a symbolic importance. I'm not sure they were made out to different gods, or one had a sacrificial purpose, but he obviously thought it was superstitious and only really, it didn't have intrinsic value or meaning. So people would say, you've got to keep the 3 fires burning, and he would say, no, you've got to extinguish the 3 fires, which would have been outrageous for some people to hear. And he said the 3 fires are greed, hatred, and delusion, and you've got to extinguish them. So he's actually positively shocking a lot of the time, I should think, but used metaphors appropriate to his time and his culture. Anyway, so what did he give us? Number 1. So yes, in all these discourses, I mean, those 1,000 pages I mentioned, those make up what are called his discourses, and those are records written down, albeit 500 years after his death, of what he is thought to have said. Those discourses haven't been memorized and repeated orally in groups until then. So what do we get from those discourses? Number 1, practical steps. This is what I think. Practical steps, you can correct me later, to follow for growth, or in other words, clear guidelines for benefiting ourselves and others. So practical steps to follow for our growth, or clear guidelines for benefiting ourselves and others. And I almost feel like I could stop there, really, because that's no small thing, is it? And if you're thinking, what's this grey, stony bloke ever done for me? Stick that, respectfully in your proverbial pipe and so on. But do it in the barn. So why is that so good? Why is that so valuable? I was very struck recently by a guy who's moved into my community not long ago. I was probably particularly struck because he's not English. I mean, there's more to it. I'm not just struck that he's English. It's actually half Belgian, half Irish, which always interests people. He's got a fantastic accent. Anyway, he was talking not long ago about the risk of being rudderless. So I was, struck as non-native English speakers saying, "Oh yes, it's a problem, isn't it, being rudderless?" And when I heard that, I thought, yes, that is the problem. That is one of the modern problems, being rudderless. Yes, the environment. Yes, appalling conflict, suffering, kind of endlessly repeated and bequeathed from one generation to another. But underneath that, and next to that quite often, not knowing really in what direction to turn or how to live or what your life really is for. So I can't think of a more valuable thing really than steering or guiding people through that, which is what the Buddha did. So it's easy to be rudderless. And I was thinking, I know that from my own experience. So just a little bit about me. I had, as I sometimes say, an expensive education. Went to Oxford University, studied modern languages, worked for a magazine in my early mid-20s, and basically sort of, I don't know, you probably know the kind of thing. I said to somebody the other day, I said to Enrico, no success was ever enough. I was extremely ambitious, very anxious, probably only valued a certain quite narrow part of myself, endlessly pushed myself. It wasn't nearly as bad as this is making it sound, by the way, but to cut a long story short, all that momentum sort of crunched. I couldn't really do it anymore. It wasn't my mould, and I had to sort of break out of it. And it was only that made me realise that I'd never quite known where I was going with my life. Because in a way, with much respect and affection for where I'm from, I was working with what I'd inherited. Do you see what I mean? Social, cultural, professional, educational, national conditioning had carried me that far, and it sort of broke, to put a long story in one word. And I didn't then know what I was going towards. Very luckily, I came across the LBC around that time. But I thought we really are at the mercy, when we're rudderless, of messages that want to tear us off into other lives all the time. I'm sure we all know. We're bombarded with advertisements and images and messages that try to persuade us all the time to start adopting another life. Every time, it's as though you could form another idea of yourself. I'm prey to it. In Bethnal Green Underground Station, I can find myself in that slightly awful minute that you have to spend somehow with my hands in my pockets, staring across the platform, thinking, maybe I should spend more time in Thailand. If you're feeling a bit tired, you're trying to spend that awful minute, you think, maybe I should discover Dubai. That's actually a really good idea. Those buildings are really, really incredibly big, and maybe that's worth going there for, I don't know. Memory foam mattress, I did sleep badly last night. £120 free delivery, I'm free next Thursday morning. I once used one and had that heat rash, maybe I'll phone them up and then there'll be a phone queue, and anyway. We get pushed and... it's not just rudderless, is it? There's hardly a sail and a mast at those moments. So we need a way through. And that's what I think the Buddha offered. And how did he do it? Well, the one thing I've chosen for this, to illustrate these practical steps to follow for our growth, that he taught repeatedly, is the ethical precepts. So there's a set of 5, there's a set of 10. If you become a mitra in our community, you undertake to practice 5. If you join the order, the 10. In the So there are 10 ethical guidelines. There's 3 for bodily action, 4 for speech, 3 for the mind. But they basically lay out what Buddhists call skillful action and unskillful action. So that means actions of body, speech and mind that conduce to pleasant, happy, helpful states, or their opposites. Basically, benefit yourself and others or harm yourself and others. I mean, it couldn't be simpler, actually. And Sangharakshita, I mean, just to telescope all those 10 into one, I'm sure scholars will be appalled by what I'm doing this evening, but there we are. I'm not one of them. Sangharakshita, conveniently, for the purposes of telescoping talks, has said that all 10 precepts are really expressions, further expressions of the first precept, which is undertaking to refrain from harming living beings. And I love that because I can't imagine you could really disagree with it. You know, I want to refrain from harming living beings. There's something actually slightly moving about the fact that it doesn't stop at humans and that it has the word living in it. Refrain from harming living beings. So that's, if you like, the ethics of restraint, as it's sometimes called, would have natural expression in, say, vegetarianism, avoiding harsh speech and so on, all the more obvious things. But I particularly also want to draw out that you've got this unskillful action in one column, if you like. I'm treasurer of the LBC these days, so I see everything in columns. In the credit column, no, just kidding. In the unskillful action column, you've got harming living beings. The skillful equivalent is basically cultivating love. So that precept, the positive form, says, with deeds of loving kindness, I purify my body. So this takes us way, way beyond the ethics of restraint. Yes, you should avoid doing harm, but no, that's probably not nearly enough. And how about, instead, a completely open-ended, expansive cultivation that you continue for your whole life? Cultivating love. We've been doing the Metta Bhavana. That's basically one of the main ways to do it. But I also just want to talk about the main way to do it in action, off the cushion, which is, of course, friendship. So Mahamani mentioned last night the Buddhist term for friendship, which is Kalyana Mitrata, Mitrata friendship. Kalyana, we sometimes translate it as spiritual friendship. Really, Kalyana means beautiful or auspicious or good. Good like the philosophers would have meant it, capital G, good. So beautiful friendship. And that is a matter of behaviour. Beautiful friendship and beautiful behaviour is an ethical matter. I've said some of that the wrong way around. One of the prime examples from the Buddha's life, anyway, is that Ananda, his chief disciple, who attended on the Buddha for many years, sorry if I'm stealing a piece of thunder from tomorrow night, but just as the Buddha was about to die, is recorded distraught, leaning against a doorpost in tears, saying, I'm still a pupil and there's so much to learn. My master now is passing away, he who was so kind. So he doesn't say he who is so wise, he who had such groundbreaking thoughts, he who walked such a long way in bare feet, but he who was so kind. So this is what I understand from the quote I read at the beginning to be my basic sense of what is being asked of me, and why I'm so relieved I feel I'm at least starting to develop that good basic sense of what's being asked of me. And just one example of when I experienced that is my Mitra ceremony. So as I mentioned, if you're happy to take on 5 precepts, say you're a Buddhist and you want to do it within this community, you do what's called becoming a Mitra, which is a simple ceremony. You make some offerings and these sort of declarations publicly. Friends and family came, lots of people in this room were there. I did it along with many others, and it was really the first time I stepped forward and said, yes, this is what I want to do. But I mean, not in a sort of job interview type way, in a public way, offering flower and candle and incense to the shrine. It's a real outing. I mean, a real coming out. People feel quite challenged by their mitra ceremony and standing up in front of people and doing this. But I had an extremely strong sense that evening, and I only realised sort of towards the end, luckily, because otherwise it would have disrupted it, that I'd never felt so in one place at one time. I was staring at the shrine and feeling some very pleasant sort of intensity, and I realised that it was just I had no thought about anything else that was happening at that moment, but not in a selfish way. Like I say, in a way, a lot of the important people in my life were in the room. And it was a very simple experience and a very happy one. You know how you always remember where you were when you made a certain phone call? I mean, you can see your surroundings, the other person can't, obviously, but I know that I went back to my house that evening. I was going out with a girl who lived in Finland at the time. She phoned me later to ask how it was, and I was closing the little wooden gate of these creepers above, and she said, "How was it?" And I sort of blurted out, "It was the best evening of my life." And then I said, "Gosh, I didn't expect to say that." And if I had expected to, obviously I would have got into a debate about whether it really was, and, can I give it top spot, and so on. And she said, "Wow." And I said, "I know." And, and I thought that must be to do with this straightforward, simple sense that that I knew what I was doing. That's what it was. I knew what I was doing for once. Thank goodness for that. Sadly unusual. Yes, and one quote from the discourses here, the Buddha often describes people in certain states. So he says, a person practicing who has this quality does this or thinks in that way. And he's talking about a monk contented. So he just means a follower of mine who is in a state of contentment. And he says, "A monk contented dwells with doubt left behind, without uncertainty as to what things are wholesome, his mind purified of doubt." So dwells with doubt left behind. I think there's a trajectory. Dwells with doubt left behind, without uncertainty as to what things are wholesome. We really, really need that. We've got such uncertainty as to what things are wholesome. His mind purified of doubt. So by the end, it's not just left doubt behind, it's been completely purified of doubt. I'm not saying that's the state I was in my mitra ceremony, but I can see that that's how you get to contentment, really, with this good basic sense of what's being asked of you, leaving doubt behind because you have practical steps to follow for your growth. So, as Buddhists, we don't just take these steps, we practice reflecting on their effects and what implications that might have. So we live out these steps and we try to reflect on the effect that that's having and what that might mean. That's a bit cryptic, so let me say more. Skillful and unskillful actions. So in those lists of 10 skillful and unskillful actions, the main point that the Buddha was making is that they create our mental states. So by mental states in Buddhism, we don't mean something in the head or simply the mind as it's thought of in secular contexts. For us, mental state means just your state, the state you're in. You could say psychophysical state. So we're creating our mental states. That creates our experience, and our experience is our world. I'm going to quote Maitreya Bandhu here because an announcement he once made in a class about this really, really struck me. He said, "You've got to work on your mind because all the experience you could ever have and will ever have is mediated by your mind." I found that amazing. You can't have an experience without your mind, and you can work on your mind. In fact, you can change your mind. The Buddha also said this, he said the same. And the first verse of the Dhammapada, which is thought to be one of the oldest collections of his sayings, begins, and I forgot to bring it with me, so let's hope I can remember it. Don't laugh yet. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, produced by mind. Okay, that's the first verse. Maybe I'll leave it at that. Okay. But there's three separate points in it, actually. I don't quite have time to tease all those out, but preceded by mind, your mind is actually there first, led by mind as they're happening, and in the end produced by mind. And it continues, he who acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like the hoof that follows, no, happiness follows like the wheel that follows the hoof of the ox. And then the second verse is like the opposite. So he's saying, well, by a pure mind, he means a skillful one. Okay, so one that is cultivating love in all these different expressions. Anyway, so this second stage of what the Buddha has taught us, is teaching us to do, these ways of reflecting on the implications of our skillful and unskillful actions, shows us that we are creating our world. So hopefully you have observed at least a bit of this on retreat. So you come here, you meditate, perhaps you've experienced some opening up. The world may seem to respond. I've heard more than one person mention lately that the weather seems to be matching their mood. And they don't mean it's raining, therefore I've got into a bad mood. They seem to mean something more like, I'm not having a good day, and look, it's raining. There seems to be some interplay between them. And as it's not just a coincidence, it's not just a funny thing, it's that we do actually get more through to a sense that it's not unrelated, objective phenomena in the world, your mood and the weather. They're not unconnected pieces of matter moving around in physical space. Something else is going on. The weather seems to fit, the world seems to join in. The other day we did a lovely puja, did the invocation to Tara, which we did last night, the mantra, for those of you who weren't here, because I think 50 of you weren't here at the time. We walked outside and there was a big, beautiful snow dump. Big flakes coming down fast. It was like the wind was blowing them down to the ground. And several people gasped as they walked out. And you can't help wondering. So the world seems to join in and cooperate, and we also find evidence for our views. So maybe you have also come on retreat, you've entered a silence and you've thought, everybody hates me, I knew it. I flipping knew it. Or I was 95% sure, but I thought I'd pay several £100, get the train to Herefordshire and make really damn sure. But no, they didn't look at me when I dropped the cornflakes, and I knew they hated me just like everybody else. Or, oh, it's so fantastic around here, all you do is walk from meditation to the lounge and you smile at someone and everybody smiles back, and I love it, it's so spiritual, even the groups were good, I love the puja, I'm getting so into the... Yeah. And the world seems to say the same thing back to you. It's not a coincidence, it's not an accident. It preceded, led, and produced by mind. Local example for you Bethnal Green residents. There's a cafe on the main road, a small, quite new cafe, Italian, and it's run, I think they have done well enough now to pay other staff, but it was opened and initially run by two Italian women who are rather beautiful, and from what I can tell, very happy. And another little mini teaching from my beloved preceptor, March Banded. We once stopped there for a coffee, we were walking back down the road, and he was saying, I hope he doesn't mind, that there is that there is some cyclical feedback loop. So you walk past, you think, hey, that looks like a great cafe. There are attractive, happy people inside. I'll stop for a coffee. And you're really enjoying yourself, and you have it standing up at the bar, because that's what they do in Italy. And people are actually speaking Italian in there, and it's really, really good coffee. And you practically feel like you're Italian. And it all goes really, really well. They do good business. They enjoy themselves, so they're grinning even more by the time the next person comes in. And it all just goes really well. So there are minds creating that, co-creating that world, all interacting. a sort of counterexample, of course there are other conditions involved. There are lots and lots of things behind this. You can't actually trace conditions. Conditions that lead to, I didn't mean to get into this, into our experience, into situations we now find ourselves in. You can never stop tracing them back. Conditions independence on which things have arisen. So I'm not sure why, but there was a rather unhappy man, I remember, who ran a bike shop not far from where I grew up. I only thought of this just after I thought of the Italian cafe today. And it was down by the train station opposite a brewery. And it was a main road, so you had traffic, but no people particularly walked past. It was quite dark in there. And he was a rather unhappy, like I say, cranky man. And he didn't do good business. The shop closed eventually. But I know that when I took in my bike to get repaired, I think I phoned him up to ask when it was ready or something, and that was a similar experience. I put off going to pick it up again because I was slightly afraid of him, actually, and it wasn't a pleasant place to go. It was actually slightly dark. You wondered, quite how he kept it going, or whether he wanted to be doing it, and all that sort of thing. But it was difficult not to be slightly deterred. So yeah, mind creating a world there as well. So I said, actually Marilyn Robinson said, a religious vocation gives you a good basic sense of what is being asked of you, which I think is a real relief, and also what to ignore. So we're also cultivating clarity. It's been a while since I've quoted the Buddha, so I better come back to him. We're cultivating clarity because that frees us from speculation and confusion. So we're reflecting on this nature of existence, but you can tell that from some of the things I'm saying about things arising in dependence on conditions, mind creating the world, you could easily get vague. I don't really know what I'm saying when I say mind creating world. I'm pretty sure that happens, but it's way, way more mysterious than that phrase would suggest. It's rather too neat, probably. So we need what's called in the tradition wise attention. The Buddha also, I said he says somebody in this state sounds like that, or somebody in that state talks like this, didn't I? And I think he also had a sense of humour. And he is saying here, he's basically doing an impression of an unwise person. I think he might have been enjoying himself. So he says, he's talking about a man failing to cultivate wise attention. And he says, this is how he attends unwisely. Quote, was I in the past? Was I not in the past? What was I in the past? Ancient Indians were very preoccupied with rebirth, as many Buddhists still are. How was I in the past? Having been what did I become in the past? Shall I be in the future? Shall I not be in the future? What shall I be in the future? How shall I be in the future? Having been what shall I become in the future? The Buddha continues, or else he is inwardly perplexed about the present, thus, am I? Am I not? I mean, Shakespeare did it better, didn't he? What am I? How am I? Where has this being come from, and where will it go? So this reflecting on our actions and deepening our reflection on our mind and the effect that we're having on our mind and how that creates our world will save us eventually from actually a sort of rudderless speculation, mental confusion and doubt, which as I said, eventually is purified, not just left behind, but purified. But even this doesn't go far enough. So the mind, which at this stage in the trajectory we're deepening our awareness of, and the fact that it is not just a mind, it's not just a brain, it's not just a thought, it's not a thing in here, we're starting to get this feeling that you can even touch when you go outside after a puja and there are big snowflakes flying at you. The mind is not a thing in here. We don't really know what it is. We don't know where the mind stops and something else starts. And there's even a Buddhist school that says there's nothing else. There's just mind. But even that is a word. So the third thing that I think the Buddha is doing with what he taught is pointing eventually even beyond these concepts that I've been describing, even beyond skillful and unskillful, and the nature of our mind, and therefore the nature of our existence, beyond our usual sphere of experience altogether, towards an ineffable completely liberating truth. So words, if they weren't failing us before, will definitely start to now, because we're getting towards the climax here. When you see clearly that you can change your mind, and that's the same as changing your world, the eventual implication of that is that complete liberation must be possible, complete freedom from suffering. We're taught that, we can take that on, as it were, intellectually. We're practicing in order to realise that, sort of realise capital R, realise as in completely embody in our experience. Nonetheless, there's a great temptation to try and explain what would be happening at this point, where flashes of insight into the nature of existence might start to coalesce together into a more generalised experience that could be called wisdom. But we probably should resist the temptation to explain. That's my quote. Sangharakshita has said, "We've been much too ready to understand, much too ready to speak, especially about the unfathomable." And I really know what he means. I mean, the acres of Buddhist literature even that try to tell you what wisdom is, what life is about, slightly obscure the fact that actually in the end it would be an experience and an unutterable one. So for fear that we take things literally and treat them only as words, even wisdom, even compassion, what we really need now is image. So it needs to depart from the conceptual sphere at this point. The Buddha actually used a lot of similes, so another part of his teaching was describing the goal, traditionally called nirvana, in many different epithets. There's a huge long list of them, but it includes things like the cool cave, the island in the flood, the further shore. So there's a lot of metaphor about crossing the stream and reaching the further shore. That's because he had this experience, he had to translate it into communication. That's how you give it to other people, hoping that they then expand back out into the experience. Rather like a poet has some inspiration. Unfortunately, we can't just give that to somebody. I think, maybe in very, very refined, otherworldly realms of being, that's what it would be like. That we wouldn't even need a poem. We could actually just put it across. Eventually, maybe there wouldn't even be an across. I don't know. But what you hope when you read what a poet hopes, I assume, when he writes one, when he writes a poem, is that you will read it, you receive it in word form, and you know what it's like. If you're not feeling receptive, I've had this experience plenty of times. You read a poem and think, so what? Because the experience isn't in the words are trying to point back to it. The hope is you read the poem and get back to something like what happened for the poet. The poem is the intermediary. Same with these images. So Nirvana's not literally the island in the flood or a cool cave. He's trying to suggest something that your mind can take and sort of drift off with, because we won't understand Nirvana. We have to imagine it and sort of deepen our minds towards it. Anyway, Buddhists help themselves do this with images. And there's a very sort of practicable way of doing that if you join the order, like I did this May, which is in the form of a visualization practice. So when we're ordained in our tradition, we're given a figure to meditate on in particular ways. So lots of people, for instance, take up the Tara meditation and try to dwell on her qualities of beauty, kindness, quickness, youth, any other sort of beautiful associations, and you try and imagine your way further and further, more and more subtly into that in your meditation. At my ordination, I took up practice of an emanation of the Buddha. Sorry, I know this is a bit confusing. Someone in my group said today, now I've heard there are 5 Buddhas. I thought there was just one. What's happening now? And I said, sort of, which probably made it worse. It's terrible we get away with giving answers like that. Anyway, Manjughosha is, if you like, an emanation of the Buddha. His particular form, he is, again, 16 years old. He's a prince. His skin is the colour of a tiger's eye. He's adorned with silks and jewels. He wears a white sash over one shoulder. In one depiction of him that I know at least, he's wearing beautiful red silk trousers tied with a string. He wears a crown. He's got long blue-black hair adorned with blue lotuses. He's holding the flaming sword of wisdom in one hand and a book called The Perfection of Wisdom to his heart in the other. He's associated with the sun, particularly. He's a solar symbol, with a lion, and with speech and communication and culture and the arts, and the list goes on and on. But what we do in these practices, or what we do in this practice, which happens to be particularly a wisdom practice, is imagine that we're in a state where we absolutely know, well actually this is what I do, I don't know what other people do, I do know what Manjughosha is. So this figure, who's actually made of light, who arises in a boundless blue sky, and embodies all these qualities, and is the perfection of wisdom and compassion, with all these particularities, the sword, the blue lotuses, etc. I imagine I know what he's telling me, if you see what I mean. There's a whole way to get into the practice, various things you establish and so on, verses you recite to him, and when that's finished, out of recognition for what you've been doing and a completely natural outflowing of his wish to benefit living beings, he, out of his heart flows his mantra, and we imagine taking it in to my heart. And I see that as sort of globes of orangey red light sinking into my chest, or sometimes just waves of the whole thing breaking over me. And it's quite interesting that I was given very unexpectedly this wisdom practice, which I had more of a compassion figure in mind until 2 days before my ordination. Took on this wisdom practice instead, and then was given a name, half of which means wisdom. And both the practice and the name I found completely beautiful, which weren't associations I expected to have with wisdom, and this practice completely beautiful. And that already said something to me about what we call wisdom. And I actually felt for the first time I had learned an inkling of something about it. So we sort of enact that understanding, imagine our way into it, and then, this can be from the sublime to the ridiculous, but imagine that I'm carrying that with me in my day. It's a very gradual process. It's going to take many, many years, but that's what I'm trying to cultivate in that practice, because that's our way of getting at what we call wisdom. One last point on this. These figures that we meditate on, usually called a yidam, often when they're depicted traditionally, they usually are a youthful figure, very beautifully dressed. And by the way, all that, of course, is a metaphor for an inner state. It's not really that there's a figure out there in the sky with certain clothes on and a sword that's on fire and a book and all that. It's a metaphor for how we are trying to become. And these yidams are often depicted traditionally. In each upper corner of the painting will be a sun and a moon at the same time. And you may have heard a bit of talk about integration. That's about gathering all your different energies, all your different selves, your different conflicting impulses, desires, wishes, and so on together, and trying to be one happily purposeful, secure being, which on our day-to-day level is possible to practice. We can relate to it, we can feel we're working our way towards that with our meditation and so on. I think the sun and the moon being there at the same time in this highly symbolic, suggestive image is getting at integration on a deeply mysterious level. So the sun and the moon are shining in the same sky. They're not cancelling each other out. The sky is still this beautiful deep blue. And that is an image for this pointing beyond our usual sphere of experience altogether. So you've got the sun and the moon in the same sky. Okay, now for something of a reveal. What I've been talking about is a traditional list, usually called the threefold way, made up of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. So that's how you'd normally hear about ethics, meditation, and wisdom. Ethics being this practicable path of steps that lead to our growth that the Buddha gave to us in these lists of skillful and unskillful action. Ways of reflecting on our experience and the implications of that for the nature of existence. That's the stage of meditation. And then the stage of wisdom is pointing beyond that to a state or a way of being, even though those descriptors aren't up to it really, don't quite get it, which cannot in the end be captured, and about which maybe you can only say that eventually your sun and your moon would rise in the same sky. Thank you.